now that Caesar Augustus, who had lasted until the 14 of the Common Era, he's the member of the Roman politician who bridges that BCE, where we've been counting down to the year 0, and then now he is in the Common Era, and he's going to live and control Rome until 14 CE. And then afterwards, he's going to leave behind a series of family members who will try to rule in a sort of a dynastic fashion, so that he had created himself as princeps, as the prime man, but the people he leaves behind him are essentially people from his family who are going to rule as if they were monarchs, even though they will not accept the title of king. But the Roman Empire that Caesar Augustus left behind is going to continue to grow. It's going to continue to expand outwards, and this map is a way for us to take a look at some of its expansion. Now remember, this was the old core of Rome, the Italian peninsula. And in their wars with Carthage, remember, they had eventually expanded outwards along these kind of directions. And later on, going back and taking control of areas like this, because these places had been allies of the Carthaginians. What's going to happen now is that the Romans are going to need to figure out how to rule this new empire. And as they expand outwards, they're encountering more people with more languages. They're encountering people with more ideas about religious identities. They're having new trade networks, new products, new climates. I mean, it doesn't take, for example, a rocket scientist to figure out that the climate of Egypt is not the same as the climate of northern England. So Rome is expanding outwards away from its traditional base in the Mediterranean Sea and is moving towards being a large worldwide empire. And let's take a little bit of a look at some of the ideas that they're going to have to deal with as they expand outwards. Not only is this map color-coded by those areas that continue to be controlled by the senatorial class, but these are also areas of expansion that are now sort of open to the control of whoever the military leader is, and that is going to be one of the things that will spur on Roman development and expansion. One idea to think about here is there a point when the empire just gets too big? For some of us more familiar with, say, astronomy, there is a thing in space called a red giant. And essentially what it is a star that is getting larger, but as it gets larger, it's actually getting weaker and destabilizing itself on its way to self-destruction. So is this kind of a sign of self-destruction? Is the Roman Empire expansion into new areas that are further and further from Rome, more and more difficult to communicate with Rome from there, more and more in need of roads and other infrastructure assignments, more and more vulnerable to outside influences and fighting forces from enemies along the borders of the emerging empire? Is expansion, is that a sign of strength? Is it a sign that the Romans are still aggressively expanding outwards because they're successful at it? Or is another way to look at it, and think of this in the back of your head, is this expansion a sign of a red giant kind of syndrome? That maybe Rome is getting further and further from its roots, further and further from where it was, and now out into the wilds of what you know as modern-day Germany, or the edge of Scotland, or on the edge of Morocco, and you have to start to ask, are those areas being integral? Are they important to the Roman Empire? Are they vital, or do they consume more resources than they're worth? More military threats to them need to be met by Roman authorities. They need to send more armies, and they need to send more soldiers, who are then, of course, not able to do other things. That, I think, is an idea that we should think about in terms of, is it a sign of strength or weakness? That's something we'll talk about as we continue to move forward. Another thing, as we look at that map, is it just provided a series of challenges. Remember, we are not living in an era here of the Roman Empire of instantaneous communication. They've done a good job at trying to provide roads and bridges and port facilities. They have tried to create various networks of communication. They've been trying to build walls in various areas to keep out the invaders. In other words, the Romans have made massive investments into infrastructure and now are ruling over people who have very different languages and laws and customs. They have very different systems of how they think about technology, about education, about loyalty, and that the Romans are now also encountering more and more people who do not have the same kind of religious beliefs that they do. And one of the things that's interesting about Rome in this time period is that the Romans, in many ways, as polytheistic right, have adopted and adapted significant numbers of gods and goddesses from various cultures they've encountered. We'll talk some more about that. But they are now doing some cultural borrowing aspects back and forth with the people that they're encountering, and we're going to have to see where that goes. The other thing that is emerging here is that increasingly on the sheer size of this, we're starting to see an issue where the Roman Empire is simply not able to stay in one piece. It is just too big. And what's starting to happen is there's sort of a breakdown on two kind of things. One, if you imagine the empire as a whole, the further north and the further west you go in the empire, the more likely you are to encounter farming communities, low density populations, not as many cities, and in many ways relatively poor in the sense that there's not a lot of trade activity, a lot of extractive resources like gold and silver mining. So that if you sort of looked at the north and the west side of the Roman Empire, you're seeing the rural, poor, Latinized part of the empire. If you looked at to the further you go to the east, you're going to encounter much more Greek-oriented culture. The prevailing Hellenistic languages that had been spread by Alexander and by the Greek colonies still was the language of most urban areas, the language of culture, the language of religion and commerce. And the Greek influence was very deep in urban areas, many of those urban areas with high population and increasingly large tax bases because they're still involved in a significant amount of long-distance trade as well as agricultural productivity. So if you take a step back and look at the empire in that 2nd century, you essentially have a Western, poor, Latin, rural, low-density area of the empire in general. And the further east you go, you have one which is much more urban, much wealthier, and much more Greek. Take a look at your reading and see how this building of the empire is going to have within it the seeds of its destruction because it's just growing too large. And within the empire itself, not only is it too large, it's also increasingly divided by language, culture, and economics. Be sure, of course, to check out if there's some sample questions to help you understand this area as well.